So thank you everybody, and I still see people who is joining us, so I'm very happy. And today, this is also a special occasion since we have the opportunity also to welcome our new professor of sociology, Hans-Jörg Trenz. So this lunch seminar is also an occasion to introduce him and to know more about his research interests and ongoing projects. We also have a colleague of Hans-Jörg Trenz participating, Annette Hepp. And so I would leave immediately the floor to Hans-Jörg. Hans-Jörg, if you want to introduce yourself, it would be very nice. And then we can start with the presentation. Today, the presentation, as you know, it will be about the resilience of public spheres in a global health crisis. Okay, so floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Manuela. And I understand that this is a lunch seminar, so you can all switch off your screens now and have your lunch. We will give you half an hour for your lunch, which is the time that we need for our presentation. And then we hope that we can enter a nice discussion. I will share the screen now.
Yes, thank you, Hans-Jörg.
And now you should see my PowerPoints, my slide.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I want to do is, first of all, to thank you all for the welcome. I am indeed new here at the Scuola. I just started 2 weeks ago. I had a very nice beginning. I had the chance to meet many of you, to talk to you, to at least some of you, and I hope that we will be able to intensify our exchange very soon. And I hope also that this seminar gives you gives a first opportunity for this. And I'm also looking forward very much to meet our PhD students, our researchers, and I know I would like to know more about all your interesting projects. So this is also an invitation for all our PhD researchers to approach me whenever they feel that they would like to discuss something with me. And I will also start giving a first course to our PhD researchers in 2 weeks. But in the meantime, for those of you who will not attend my course, you can always contact me. I'm around. I try to be here not on a daily basis, but almost. So I'm here quite regularly. And so this is to give you some information about my current research before we start the presentation of the paper that was distributed for today's seminar. So I wanted to start by giving a short overview of my other research areas, which I'm currently involved in, to start also a dialogue with you here at the Scuola. And most generally, my research area right now is public sphere, media transformations in the digital age, processes of digitalization, and the transformative aspects of society, what is sometimes referred to as disrupted public spheres. But also the question, what happens after disruption? And the whole debate on post-democracy, post-liberalism. So this is a topic of resistance, protests, but also the resilience of the public sphere and the democratic project that is linked to it. And I'm working on a monograph actually on these topics, and I would be happy to discuss some chapters with you in the next future. And more specifically then, I have listed here some of my research projects which I'm currently involved in. These are the funded projects. One is Enlightened Trust and Governance, which is a Horizon project. It is the idea to look at the dynamics of trust building in democracy, but also to look at the role of distrust. So not to disregard distrust as something that is dysfunctional or non-democratic, topic, but to re-evaluate distrust in governance as a contribution also to democratic forms of governance, and then also to look at ways to improve trust relationships in governance. Then I have a second project, which is a Jean Monnet network. I participate on post-truth politics. These Jean Monnet networks, they're of course meant for traveling and for conferencing, which is not something that we were able to do last year, and we will also not be able to do this for the coming months. But we found a quite creative a way to use our money, which is that we produce the podcasts on these topics. And so for those of you who are interested in fake news and disinformation, take a look at our website. It's an Icelandic partner who is running this, and we produced 10 podcasts so far. I think they are quite well done. And I was also planning actually to continue producing podcasts. Once you are into this, you start liking it. I could do this in Florence. So if any of you knows interesting people, some initiatives, local initiatives, or journalists, NGO, or any politicians, or also scientists active in the struggle against fake news and disinformation, let me know and we can organize these podcasts. Then I have a third project, which is on EU differentiation, dominance, and democracy, which is former employer Arena, the Center for European Studies of University of Oslo. And there we take a critical view on EU differentiated governance and its impact on democracy again. I will be responsible for a study on EU correspondence, EU journalism. Then we finished a project on transnational solidarity at times of crisis. I'm mentioning this because I know that many here at the Scuola are also working on related topics on solidarity. We will have a book out, which is a monograph written with 3 colleagues on transnational solidarity and the media, which is out with Routledge in April is the publication date. Then my main focus actually is this fifth project, which is on value conflicts in Europe, and the question of value polarization and how social media, how digital media contribute to value conflicts and to a polarization on democratic values. So the question whether democratic values are more fundamentally challenged through online debates, through dynamics of online communication. And here we run a survey in 6 countries. We also do quantitative and qualitative content analysis of social media debates. This is funded by Volkswagen. It's a project that we only started last year, which I will continue here also at the Scuola. And related to this, we have a 6th project here on the lockdown of the public sphere, on value contestation and digital mobilization during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a 1-year project, which is also funded by Volkswagen, and research will be also carried out here at the Scuola. I'm mentioning this because I know that you are running related projects on COVID-19 communication, I think it is, which is funded by a grant from a Regione Toscana. So we might decide to develop our projects together here. And this is also the reason why I decided to present this paper here, which is co-authored. It's a joint venture with colleagues from Berlin, from Freie Universität and from the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin, where I was invited as a guest researcher last year. I was staying with them for 6 months, but then 3 of these months I spent in lockdown in Berlin. We took up this topic to write about the public sphere in lockdown. And the reason why I'm presenting this paper now, it's a paper that is meant to be for a special issue for the Journal of Javnost. The reason why I wanted to discuss this paper with you today is that we urgently need feedback, because we are in the process of rewriting the paper. So we need some critical feedback to improve it. And this is also the reason why I have invited my co-authors to join this presentation today. There are actually 4 co-authors, but one of them, Annette Heft, is here with us today, and she has agreed to share the presentation of the paper. The topic of the paper then is the public sphere lockdown. What happens to the public sphere of enlightenment in times of a global pandemic? This is the overall research question that we raised for the special issue. And you read here the public sphere of enlightenment. You might argue that this is a thing of the past, but still there are quite elementary questions what the public sphere is about, which have gained relevance actually now in response to this COVID-19 pandemic. So what happens, for instance, to rationality, to reasoned debates in times of a global pandemic? What is the role of science in public debates? How can authorities deal with irrational public responses? But also, do authorities create rational responses to crisis? Or do we observe abuses of power or dysfunctional government in relation to the health crisis? And does the pandemic lead to the spread of disinformation? Does it make fake news more salient? Does it lead to a rise of populist opposition or to new populist forms of government even? So what are the conditions for such disruptive forces of democracy? What are the underlying dynamics here? So this is the question of democracy and also of democratic legitimacy in times of a global pandemic. And since March last year, we experienced one lockdown after the other. Right now, since Monday, we are again here in Zona Arancione in Tuscany. And this means, of course, this has practical relevance. It means that civic rights, liberties are quite seriously curtailed. And how can then such a suspension of democratic rights be justified? How is it accepted by the population? What reactions does it trigger? So what is our take on this? First, we say that the COVID-19 pandemic we are analyzing here the period of spring 2020. So we are not expanding our research to the kind of second wave after the summer. Our empirical observations are still restricted to this first period of the pandemic. And what we observe is that it led within a very short time to a rather unprecedented moment of societal standstill. So public spaces became inaccessible. We were experiencing this in Berlin, which is usually a very lively city, but from one day to the other, encounters with others were defined as risks. The lockdown of public life quite radically and in a very short time changed culture, politics and markets. And of course, people and also government were largely unprepared to face this. People were forced into privacy. And for us then, sitting in Berlin in our private homes, we were wondering, can there be a lockdown of the public sphere? Can society even temporarily withdraw to privacy? Can public life be shut down? And our tentative answer was no, this is very unlikely. And in fact, the experience of the last 10 months proved us right that public spheres do not simply disappear from one day or the other or are shut down. And what are the reasons to expect this? Well, this has a little bit to do also with the conceptualization of the public sphere. You can close down maybe a public space, but you can't really close down a public sphere because a lot of what happens in the modern public sphere is virtual anyway. So we participate in a shared public sphere through the media dominantly, and not necessarily through public encounters on the market square, on the forum, or on the agora, like this was the case in the old Greek cities. So in addition then, a public sphere is there to raise issues of shared concerns. And if the pandemic raises shared concerns, of course, this will give rise to a kind of rebirth, to a resurgence of public spheres, to claim the validity of norms, to claim for democracy, to claim for rights. So we can expect that, especially in a situation when rights are restricted, that public mobilization would follow. So public spheres are there to raise concerns, to address problems of shared relevance. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic gave rise to a lot of concerns. Concerns about the expected negative impact of the lockdown. And what we observe is that media consumption was growing as people were forced in isolation. They were also in need of orientation and in need to get accurate information. And this enhanced the public debates in the media, through television, through newspapers, and of course through social media. And then these public debates again contributed to the widespread uncertainty because there were no ready-made answers to this new situation. And this put governments increasingly under pressure of legitimation. So now it is almost 1 year that we live in this kind of emergency situation. We have never experienced, I think, in our whole adult life, so many restrictions to our freedom, to our rights. We have never had reasons to fear also so much economic uncertainty for the next future and for the distant future also. So how do we deal with this? Why do we accept all this? And do we accept this? And what does it make with our democracies? So there's a new consensus with government right now here in Italy, like never seen before. Also, that the government was almost unanimously set in place. But there's also a lot of opposition, and there's a lot of potential opposition. So what they say then, that the COVID-19 crisis can be said to disrupt normal modes of public sphere functioning in the form of providing audiences with reliable and with necessary information. The public sphere was no longer able to give people orientation and also to facilitate participation in public life. So Corona can be said that it had disrupted the normal functioning of the public sphere, but it did not suspend the public sphere. So under normal circumstances, the public sphere functions as an uncertainty reducing mechanism. And what we observe here is a kind of exceptional crisis mode of the public sphere, where the public sphere, where actors in the public sphere and audiences need to face enhanced uncertainty. So instead of uncertainty reducing mechanism, the public sphere faces this increased uncertainty. And knowledge is not yet available, it becomes uncertain, orientation is lost. And there's uncertainty how information can be used, what kind of information should be used for political decision making. And this, of course, increases then a kind of confrontational mode of public sphere. So what follows from crisis then? We could expect that there is a public sphere disruptions. This is the first possibility, which would be a kind of breakdown. And examples would be polarization, radicalization, expressions of extremism, conspiracies also. And we certainly do not lack examples for all this. But we are critical here. We ask how likely is actually such a disruption. It is, of course, very visible when it happens. Those who cry out loudest are often those who are also gain invisibility. But do they actually get support? And here we would say that this is not necessarily the case. More likely is actually that the public sphere activates a kind of protest and resistance mode. And this is also what a well-functioning public sphere is supposed to do. It should facilitate voice, and it should channel protest, where people have the opportunity to reclaim rights. And protest and resistance is something, of course, that we observe in many forms, and we take this into consideration in our paper. But then besides these traditional forms of political mobilization, we think that there is a third form of public sphere reactions that might become highly relevant here. And this is what we call resilience. So what we mean by this is rather broadly defined. We expect the public sphere to face uncertainty by entering an experimental mode. So resilience is commonly described as coping practices, but there's also the chance then to overcome established routines, to innovate, to activate processes of social change and of learning. And this is interesting now because public sphere scholars are typically interested in forms of resistance, in contentious politics. But resilience is not so much taken into consideration. So we tried here also to occupy a new research agenda, which we call public sphere resilience. And this will be a neglected field of public sphere research, also maybe a neglected field in research on political mobilization, because resilience is not simply private. It is not simply unpolitical. We would claim that resilience has an important political component. It's a form of civic engagement. This is one reason then to focus on resilience, that it gains in importance. You can speculate why it gains in importance. Maybe that's a topic for a debate, for our discussion later. I have some tentative answers to this. And with this, I would like to hand over to Annette to continue with the presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Hans-Jörg. Can you hear me well?
Absolutely.
Okay, fine. Yes, I'm happy to go on. And actually, we were not only thinking about those interplays and those experimental modes and changes between resilience and resistance. We also thought about where is most of this ongoing experimentation with public spheres happening. And what the crisis very openly showed is that digital public spheres were really enhanced through this crisis and through those described lockdowns of physical spaces. So what we saw in almost every aspect of our lives, both in the private and in work-related aspects, was that digitalization got an enormous push through the crisis. And this relates to digital technologies overall, but more particularly to the ways in which they are used and in which ways they have been further developed and appropriated by people during this pandemic situation. And what we argue is that the digital affordances, to some extent, they even enabled transnational forms of publicness. For example, if you consider that governmental responses to the crisis in one country were related to the situation in other countries, and that this was openly discussed in public in the form of transnational public sphere. And the other is that the digital affordances became tools for social exchange in many areas, both in private and public areas, and they became main places which were a place to go instead for the public places which were no longer accessible. And with respect to the ways how those digital technologies are appropriated in the context of the crisis, we discussed 4 areas or 4 examples in which we might be able to observe those transitions between usual normal modes of functionings of public spheres, between the experimental mode of resilient practices, and eventually also between resistance practices. And we look at 4 areas in our paper, and the first area is the area of political consumerism. And we understand political consumerism as a form of participation, which enables citizens to achieve political goals through their consumer choices. And what we argue is that we, during the pandemic, observed how people used those buying choices to make a stance and to act in resistance to the problems which were brought about by the crisis. So on the one hand, we observed a little bit of boycotts of certain companies, where people have been called for not buying from certain companies, and also where protests have been staged. But they the actual boycotts in the streets, they really faced barriers, at least during this first phase of the crisis where we really had a lockdown. And what happened instead was, as we would argue, a resistance mechanism, because resistance has been developed as those boycotts moved from the streets to digital places. So there had been created lots of websites and places in which people have been asked to support small businesses, in which people created digital spaces to relocate the buying and selling, but also to relocate the activities which before that time had been taking place in local areas. And in this way, those consumer choices, they also to some extent became politicized. So this was no longer a private decision, but it was a political decision and a political action to make consumer choices in order to support local companies, local restaurants, etc. A second area we discuss is the area of neighborhood solidarity during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we had a lot of talk about solidarity practices, and we required a lot of solidarity, especially in the situation of social distancing. So, but people had to redefine and to reinvent solidarity, and they very often did this in online digital spaces. And we can observe in this regard new modes of digital resilience, which are practiced in order to mitigate the effects of the crisis. And this has been done to one extent through the adaptation of existing practices. So there have been digital spaces before which are meant for solidarity and for buying and selling on the private level, but during the pandemic, those spaces have been used in a much more intense way, and also the content and the actions which have been taken in those digital spaces, they changed a lot during the pandemic. So that digital places such as nebenan.de, which have been for buying and selling, they now have been used to organize solidarity and neighborhood help. And in this form, we have a digital space which had been there before, but which had been adapted to the new situation and which also had been politicized in this adaptation to this new situation. And on the other hand, we have a lot of new digital spaces which have been created exactly for helping participating in solidarity actions, and which have been created in order to overcome this closure of public place and to relocate those activities into the digital. And there is another area which we can observe during the pandemic. This is the area of protest and of street manifestations of protest. And obviously, street manifestations were heavily disrupted, at least in the first phase of the crisis, due to the strong crisis regulations and also due to the uncertainty which was there, because people had fear whether they would threaten their individual lives if they participate in mobilizations. And what we see with respect to mobilization are, in our view, two things. We would argue two things happened. And one is what we call a resilience practice, because practices of protest have been relocated to the digital place. So, for example, they have been adapted from street protests and changed to protests in digital places, or in many cases to hybrid variants, doing protest events with a limited number of people, but trying to have most of this protest activity going on in the digital space. This is a relocation which reacts to the closure of open places. And they have been there, but of course we can argue and we can discuss to what extent they have been able to be successful and to raise awareness to issues. And while this is a form of reaction and a form of coping, we argue there is then this other form, in which situation we really talk about resistance, and this is in the form of mobilizations against the corona measures from the governments and against the corona framing and the corona narrative. And here in this form, we would say this second type of action, this is really a form of resistance, because those demonstrations and those mobilizations, they were really directly against government measures and wanted to react against this. And this is a difference between the adaptation mode and the resistance mode against what is going on. And there is a fourth news sphere we discussed, and Hans-Jörg Trenz would go on with this fourth area.
Yes, the fourth area is the pandemic news sphere, where we look at patterns of news consumption as practices of resilience. And what we observed, you all remember this, in the first weeks of the pandemic in March 2020, we became news junkies. We spent our whole day reading news online, on social media, through television, through the radio, from the morning to the evening. So information seeking became a kind of pastime during the lockdown. But of course, it was also relevant to confront risk and uncertainty. And this changed news strategies. So people were relying on news to reduce uncertainty and to face the health risk of the pandemic. So they were looking out, and this can be proven through first surveys that we have on news consumption, that people were looking out for quality news. So quality news gained importance. Tabloid news style became less important, and also fake news, despite of the kind of fear of a fake news pandemic or of an infodemic, actually lost importance. There's a second moment then where people who for weeks and months were confronted with negative news had enough and turned away from news. So this is something that we can observe. This is also proven by surveys for the second period of the pandemic, that news consumption in many Western countries went down again. There's also an interesting transnational dynamics of how news are consumed and also how news are made. And this is quite interesting that we are becoming interested in how the pandemic develops in other countries. It's a global pandemic, and there's awareness of the global aspects. And some examples of this, for instance, how we use other countries as measurements for our own performance. If you look at these comparative statistics and these rankings that are used in the news media and that are very popular. So there's a kind of global problem framing that is also going on. And yeah, that's it for the time being. Our preliminary findings here of the first phase of the pandemic, of resilience practices during the first phase of the pandemic. For the discussion, I list here some points. One would be whether this infodemic is a driver of social unrest and conflict. Of course, there is some evidence for this. Another question is the role of populist parties in the pandemic. Are they losers? I think there's evidence for both. And then also a more theoretical question for discussion is the whole nexus between resilience and resistance. Is this a transitory relationship, that resilience is what we observe in the first phase of the pandemic during lockdown, and that resistance in the form of street manifestations increases over time? Or is this something that happens in parallel, that we observe both resilience and resistance, maybe with shifting emphasis and in multifaceted forms? Or a third possibility is that resilience is an opposition strategy to resistance. This has to do with the fact fact that resistance is not always nice, and it can be perceived also as a threat. If you look at some of the anti-lockdown protests, for instance, that are taken over by populist or right-wing forces, this might then trigger citizens to develop forms of civic engagement that are less salient and more local. So resilience would gain in importance precisely because resistance has become so deeply reactionary. That's it for today, and I give over to Manuela.
Manuela, il microfono.
Yes, I was. Yes, thank you for this very fair, also comprehensive overview of all your projects and all the research fields that you are now investigating. I believe in Italy the floor we also have a discussant, since according to our recent tradition, we always open the general discussion with a discussant. And in your case, the discussant will be Niccolò Pennucci. Niccolò, are you here?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, so
okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Trenz. That was very interesting. I also read the paper before the presentation, so I agree that the most theoretically interesting point in the paper is the nexus between resilience and resistance, but as it has already been widely explored in the presentation, and also yourself, you put that on top of the discussion, I will not go further on that. So I noted 4 main points of discussion that concerns me, because I have to say that this paper gives some optimism in terms of the possibility of having a digital public sphere coming out from the pandemic. And my 4 points are a bit more critical in this respect. So the first one is very general. So we have perhaps to understand the role of digital platforms in shaping digital public spheres. And digital platforms are not neutral actors. They are driven by business models, and they are at the very center of what is called nowadays data economy. So they are not neutral. And so to what extent are they able to be the digital media infrastructure of a truly public sphere, if we understand public sphere as neutral from state control and market logic? Because in my opinion, digital platforms, they give the floor to both these actors to shape the public sphere. So to me, this is something that must be further problematized. The second one is a problem concerning equality, the access to the public sphere, because if we are switching to a mainly online public sphere, the accessibility of the internet has 2 problems with equality. The first one being among states, because there are states that are more advanced in digitization, and there are states that are not so advanced. And this is true also in the context of the European Union. So there could be places in which the public sphere can be further developed, and places in which this is not the case. But also at the individual level, because, for instance, elderly people cannot have so straightforward access to digital technologies, and so they can be cut off from the public sphere. And so this, to me, seems to be quite problematic when we think about the public sphere, mainly as a digital tool. My third point deals with the neighbor solidarity. Actually, I heard a previous discussion with Professor Anastasia Cavada from the University of Westminster, who did a very interesting research on neighbor solidarity on WhatsApp, developed on WhatsApp in the UK. And this, to me, as a, let's say, scholarly oriented problem, which is how can we do research on public sphere if we switch from public, let's say, platforms such as Facebook, in which there are public posts, to chats, in which there are individual data data concerns that researcher cannot reach, and so maybe it becomes very difficult to understand how the public sphere is actually structured. And my third and final comment has to do with the news system, because it seemed to me when we were at the very beginning of the first lockdown that there was a huge polarization among what is considered to be the truth, which is like the scientific truth that let's say put in place public policies, and people who contest such public policies, which are by default considered as negationists or people who spread fake news and so on and so forth. So to what extent in the global pandemic crisis, dissent towards public policy and government official position can be possible without having such a polarization between what the government says as the truth and what people, which can be also considered an act of resilience or resistance, it is legitimate, and it is not, let's say, easily put out of the public sphere as something which is not scientific, not valid, and therefore potentially damaging for the public sphere. So these are my main four comments on the paper. So thank you again for the presentation, and I hope that the discussion which will follow will be very productive.
Thank you, Niccolò. Hans-Jörg, if you don't mind, I saw that Donatella raised her hand after your presentation, so I don't know if she wants to add something.
Yes, if you want, I can add a couple of things. I think there is a lot of room for synergies with our projects and communication. I had reflections on the use of public sphere in a moment in which I think it becomes so clear that there are so many public spheres. So how the pandemic can also challenge the idea of this one encompassing public spheres, when we see also from your research that so many new spheres are created, or that rules tend to change, that actors tend to change. This is more at the theoretical level. At the empirical level, we have also been doing research on protest, solidarity, and knowledge. So similar a bit to your different focuses. In the protest, on the protest side, we see a lot of protest on social issues. Today, I had Sven Hutter in my class, and he presented the results of this research they have done on 2020. And there, the dominant issues is demonstrations by queer denkers. And I wonder if it is just a bias of the reporting, or if there is such a differences in the protest between Italy and Germany.
Hans-Jörg, I think if you want, you can start answering, and then we open the general discussion. We collect more comments and questions.
Well, I would actually prefer to collect more points, that we enter into a discussion now, and then I take notes here and can provide a response later.
Okay. So if there are other questions or comments or any kind of curiosity, you can ask. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I think that you have to answer.
Yes. I will be selective. Thanks, first of all, to Nicolo for this very informed comment, which raises also some fundamental issues of what is a public sphere and what is an online public sphere, and how do digital platforms contribute to the building of an online public sphere, and also what are the limits of this. And you partly mentioned this yourself. I have no objections to this. What is interesting maybe is your last point on truth. And your observation was that the public sphere here is particularly challenged because truth is kind of essentially challenged. And scientific truth is not necessarily the kind of truth that is debated or that is contested in public spheres. It is part of it. So the question here is, what authority does science gain in public debates? What is the role of experts? How much trusted are experts? So the public sphere, in a way, is there to link debates about truth to trust. The public sphere builds trust relationships, and the defenders of truth, which can be scientists and experts, need to be trusted. And this is now open to empirical investigation. What was the role of scientists in debate? I think there's evidence to say that, of course, scientists gain prominence. We all know the names of the main virologists. They became kind of TV stars, and they certainly also gained in authority. At the same time, they are contested. So contestation is not necessarily excluded. This might be even in parallel, that science or that the voice of science, of course, becomes more salient, gains in authority, is also translated into governmental action. It clearly informs government. Also, government to a large degree relies here on scientific inputs to take decisions. This might also be a turn in government to listen to science during the pandemic. I would expect that there are huge country differences in how science gains or has gained prominence, and in how government responds to science. And also huge, and these country differences might be partly explained precisely by trust. So trust relationships are important here, and high trust countries are those where also scientists gain authority, whereas low trust countries are those where scientists have difficulties to get through with their voice. So this is a kind of relationship that needs to be investigated further. Donatella raised these questions of country differences between Italy and Germany. You know, I'm observing both countries quite closely, and I definitely agree that there are these country differences. So there is a much higher salience of socio-economic issues in Italy than in Germany. This already became visible in the autumn when the EU recovery plan was discussed, and the emphasis was quite different in public debates in Germany and in Italy, which is also a potential then for transnational conflicts, including government, political parties, but also populations.
Maybe if I may add some points, actually, especially with respect to the protest dynamics, I find it very interesting to observe those changes which have taken place over time, and especially in Germany, during the first phase of the pandemic, there was almost no resistance against anything. And this really started then in the second half of last year. And this is really, really strong on those sides of the Querdenken populist to the far right and all the conspiracy theory groups, and almost not related to really all the social issues which are also very challenging and which are brought about by those government measures. So this is a very interesting development, and we are also in contact with with Hutter and with the WZB group and observing what they do. It might be true that when we were writing the paper, which was in the first half year of last year, we were more impressed by the many new ways of coping with the situation and with the positive reactions and with the many new and positive developments online. And they not only related to the usual platforms such as Facebook or something like this, where you can really be concerned about how do platform affordances and how does the platform governments in the back influence what is able or which actions can be taken and so on. But what we observed is that many also develop new platforms or develop online websites and such things. So for that reason, I would not be that concerned about really this platform influence, which has been raised by the first commenter. But I would agree that we would probably come to a more mixed picture. But my feeling is what we wanted to say. It's both. It enables both reactions, and it enables resistant practices which would not be able to be taken in that way without those digital affordances. But of course, also, and the switch was very quickly from resistance then really also to resilience, and the switch was also quickly, or the dynamic was also strong between going back to public place as soon as possible, because also for the reasons that this can have more impact and is more visible, gains more salience. So this was also one point we observed, and we didn't focus on this part of the paper in the presentation. This is really a dynamic development and back and forth, and for that reason also this transitioning between both modes and between online and offline would be something which is of particular interest, at least in my perspective, because it goes back and forth, and it always has been there both, but in the crisis situation the digital possibilities at least helped to overcome the hardest problems of the crisis. And I wanted to highlight that I really take this point, participation of the elderly, with me, and think that we should consider more the limitations of those digital spaces in terms of who can be participant and who will be integrated and who will not have access to those spaces.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would, by the way, not underestimate the elderly internet users. I would rather be concerned with the young people, actually. But yeah.
Maybe depending on the platform where you look.
That is also the case, yes.
Yes, thank you to everybody. I would ask once again all the people if there are some more questions or more comments, remarks.
Maria Kusis.
Yes, Maria?
Hi.
Very welcome.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you very much, Hans-Jörg. And I'm sorry I was not able to listen to the whole talk, but entered later. So I don't know if you have already answered this. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the influence of bots. You mentioned the issue of trust. Have there been any studies on the possible effect or describing how much bots have influenced some parts of the public sphere?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, Maria. Nice to see you, first of all. And the question of bots has not been investigated by us. So to provide you with a response, I would need to do some research myself to find out whether any research has been done on these aspects. This is certainly quite relevant to understand the debate, especially in some countries. I'm thinking here, for instance, on the US, but also Brazil. So I would expect there are huge country differences, but I'm not aware of any recent study. But Annette, you might be more informed than me.
At least I can add that colleagues from Münster are working on a study which in detail collected content during the pandemic on social media platforms, and which is still, as far as I know, looking at to what extent do they find instances of unauthentic behavior, and which seems to signal that there is something not human spread information included. And we can share, I can share to Hans-Jörg the sources and what's going on, but I'm not aware at the moment whether they really already have findings or have finished this and can, so therefore I cannot give an exact answer with regard to which proportions might be unauthentic, but I know that there are scholars doing studies in this direction right now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I also would have a comment, and actually two comments, and which both focus on the point you raised at the end in your conclusionary slide concerning populism. And so pandemic and populism, are they the loser or the winner? And I thought while listening that your research can also be nicely linked to the recent debate, the normative debate actually, concerning the question of populism is bad or is bad or good for democracy. Of course, this is a normative question. Some authors, as you know, think that populism, since it appeals to an homogeneous people and can be a threat to democracy and pluralism and the protection of minorities, but also there are other scholars who think that populism actually bring back people to passionate politics, and therefore also is able to speak, to a large group of people which have been neglected by mainstream politicians. And therefore, I think that in both cases, these are theoretical questions that can be answered empirically. And your project somehow can go also in this direction. This would be my first remark. In particular, I was wondering, but partly you have already answered in your presentation, if you plan to empirically differentiate the different types of senders and recipients of the frames in these online public spheres. So, following partly the suggestion of Donatella concerning the probably presence of many public spheres, I was wondering if you plan to empirically differentiate between different types of actors and frames, exclusionary, inclusionary. And my second point on this regard would actually refer to networks. So, since, again, reflecting on populism and the COVID, we can also address the point concerning polarization versus solidarity. So, is the pandemic an occasion for an occasion or an arena for polarization and an occasion for some political forces to introduce polarizing frames in the public sphere? Or is it an occasion to build the solidarities? Because we also have been seeing solidarities, solidarity events emerging in this emergency situation. Therefore, again, my point will be about the empirical analysis of these big concepts. So I was wondering if you also plan to detect some networks, not only different types of actors, frames and networks, so different communities and the direction, let's say, of these communities' communication. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuela. This is more a question for future research. It raises partly new research agendas, so I can only give tentative answers to this now, also because the pandemic, of course, is still ongoing. So it will be difficult to investigate this and conclude and draw conclusions right now. What I observe is that populist strategies during the pandemic are difficult. The established populist strategies do not really apply or are unsuccessful. And for instance, the whole idea of populism to contest scientists creates, of course, a lot of visibility. It creates at the same time, however, a lot of public concern. And so it enhances uncertainty, which is not exactly what people are looking for right now in the pandemic. So people want to have certainty. They want to reduce risks. Populists, their mobilization strategies rather increase risks or are themselves perceived as a threat by people. I think we could observe this partly in Germany with these summer protests. You might remember it was highly visible in the media, the anti-lockdown protests taking place in Berlin, broadcasted through television worldwide, the parliament that was taken in assault by some radicals. We don't know exactly where these people came from, not exactly partly right-wing radicals, partly conspiracists, but supported by populist parties in Germany, by the AfD. The reaction to this was actually contrary. So instead of getting support, they clearly lost support, and this is shown in public opinion polls, which show that people were scared by these people basically and turned away. So the AfD lost a lot of support in reaction to this protest. So this is not exactly successful. And my prediction here would be that populists, at least in this first year of the pandemic, lost support. I think this is also supported by evidence in other countries. But there might be country-specific, and we don't know the end result. So the pandemic is ongoing. And with regard to solidarity, you were mentioning debates that kind of contest solidarity, more contentious debate, more polarization, or on the other hand, a kind of turn to solidarity. Here again, I would say that what we observed during the first year is rather a solidarity turn. So there is consensus, there is a growing consensus and less polarization than we had before the pandemic. So I don't see much evidence that the pandemic has contributed to further polarization. I would contest this.
Thank you, Hans-Jörg. Okay, thank you also, Annette. I don't know if there are some more comments or questions. We can also conclude here our lunch seminar, and no, there are not. So we can conclude. Let me see, because sometimes okay, no, it was Manuela Moschella just informing us that she has to go. So thank you once again to both the presenters, and we hope to see you, or at least Hans-Jörg, soon in presence all together. And the next, I also take the occasion to remind that the next lunch seminar will be on the 5th of March. In March, actually, we will have two events on the 5th, and with Maurizio Steni, and on the 17th with Professor Morlino, who is going to talk about democracy. And okay, thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to
Yes,
be.
indeed. Thanks for your inputs. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.